virtual infrastructure components and installing ESX. So we've really taken the first part of this series and outlined really what are the concepts associated with virtualization. And we used VMware Workstation as the tool with which to explain a lot of these concepts. And the main reason why we've used VMware Workstation as that tool is because with the release of VMware Workstation 6.0, we get some new fancy features that allow us to set up ESX and virtual infrastructure environments inside of VMware Workstation. It's kind of like a VM in a VM concept. Now, what's really cool about this is that until just very recently, with the release of 6.0, all of this VM and a VM concepts were not possible, and all of the updates to VMware Workstation 6.0 that allow the use of the hypervisor, the hardware hypervisor, and the VT extensions, and all of this extra functionality actually enables this to function so it's fast enough to actually be usable. What we're going to do at this point is we're going to talk about virtual infrastructure. We're going to talk about VMware ESX and all the data center products associated with ESX. And then we're going to build an instance of virtual infrastructure using VMware Workstation. Now, it's important for you to know that you don't necessarily need to use VMware Workstation to build this demo environment if you're following along. If you have the server equipment in your network that's available and you know that it can connect in and you've got it's on the HCL and everything, then you know you can do it, feel free to use that server equipment because your performance is going to be improved by doing that. But if you have VMware Workstation and you have a fast enough system that has the Intel VT extensions or any kind of virtualization extensions that is supported by VMware Workstation 6, then you can use Workstation 6 as a kind of a poor man's way of simulating this ESX environment. We're going to talk about what are the components associated with ESX, the virtual center, the VIC, or the virtual infrastructure client, and all those other components and how they interrelate. We're going to talk about the prerequisites that are required for ESX, and those prerequisites are relatively hefty. And then we're going to actually do an installation of ESX. We're going to create 2 ESX instances, and then we're going to use later on those ESX instances to connect them into a virtual infrastructure, and then also to do some vMotioning back and forth between them in later nuggets. And then lastly, we're going to license ESX, and we're going to use some demo eval licenses for our purposes. But in your environment, you may use eval licenses, or you may have full versions of the licenses associated. Now, the very first thing we want to actually do is talk about what are the components associated with virtual infrastructure. It's kind of easier if we draw a picture of what are all those components, because there are a number of components that you're going to have to actually build up in order to build your virtual infrastructure. Now, remember, virtual infrastructure is the idea of taking these VMs, these virtual machines, and creating an infrastructure with which to host them on. And the idea here is you want to be able to sort of decouple that box that you have loaded into your data center and decouple that from being an instance of a server. Instead, you want to begin to think of that as just a collection of resources, a collection of processor and RAM and I/O resources and network resources that you use for purposes of hosting machines. And so when you're creating a virtual infrastructure, what you need to do is set up a series of ESX chassis or ESX servers that are going to host those virtual machines. Let's say, for example, here I have a series of 3 chassis, for example, in my virtual infrastructure here, and I'm going to show them with the wide angle rectangle to show kind of like a server in a rack. And each one of these chassis actually has on it ESX. So I've got ESX installed onto each of these 3 boxes. This is the ESX installation that you get when you install the ESX CD, essentially, right off of the VMware website. You can, for an ESX installation, have that ESX installation have local drives. ESX supports DAS, or direct attached storage drives, that are inside of these ESX servers. For example, a ProLiant DL380 has the availability to install 6 local drives in it. So you can have those 6 local drives that you install ESX onto, and then you run your virtual machines off of those local drives. That's one way that you can do it. However, if you have local drives, you do not have shared drive storage, you won't be able to make use of a lot of the fun, exciting migration features, hot migration features that virtual infrastructure has. You can still run virtual machines, and you can still do what are called cold migrations, which is the idea of moving a machine from system to system while it's powered off. But with local attached drives, you're not going to have all of those enterprise class levels of high availability that you would normally have. For the most part, in order to fully support, to fully make use of a virtual infrastructure, you have to have a really big data store. And this is my little symbol here. This cylinder is my symbol for a really big storage area network. So I've got some sort of storage area network here that my ESX servers need to connect into in order for them to be able to use the drive space on that storage area network. Now, inside of that storage area network, I may have chopped out a little area into that storage area network that's a volume. And this volume is where all of my ESX servers are connecting in and where the hosting of all those little virtual machines are going to sit. Let's see, I've got a couple little virtual machines that are sitting in here. Now, going back to what I said just a second ago, it doesn't, again, really matter where that virtual machine sits once you have your full virtual infrastructure configured and set up. You don't really care where those virtual machines sit anymore because the VMDK file, the disk file that comprises that virtual machine is actually sitting on the storage area network. The processing of that file actually happens by the processors on this ESX server here, any one of these ESX servers. So again, you can begin to stop thinking about servers as, again, that device that's sitting inside the rack, but instead is a collection of resources that you use to deploy a system. Now, obviously, for us to be able to manage this environment here, we have to have a monitor server, kind of a server that watches everything to make sure everything is functioning just fine, and that's our virtual center server. Our virtual center server can be a virtual machine that sits on side of one of our ESX boxes, but typically is another server that is not virtualized that sits outside of the environment. And there are a lot of different reasons for this. You know, if your ESX environment happens to crash, you don't want your virtual center server to crash along with it. You want that to be kind of outside the environment and looking at the environment as a third party. That virtual center server does not necessarily need to be connected to the SAN. It can have its own local storage and everything, but it does need to be connected via networking, via the intranet, so that it can manage and monitor your EXX infrastructure. When you install this virtual center server, that's the point when you actually stop managing ESX servers as individual units. You can then begin to manage your ESX servers as a collection of units. And we'll show, actually, later on in this nugget, we'll show how you can manage your ESX servers as individual units. And when we begin to talk a little later on about Virtual Center and how to install Virtual Center, how we kind of change the mindset for how we manage our ESX servers once we move into the Virtual Center. Now, in order to be able to purchase all of this, you actually have to purchase ESX as a license, and it's licensed per core. So if you have 2 processors and 2 cores, and you have 4 total processors, you only need to buy a two-core license or a two-way license for each instance of your ESX server. If you have 4 ways, and each way has, or if you have 4 sockets, and each socket has a number of processors in that socket, then you need to purchase by that socket. So all of the ESX licensing is licensed per the socket. Now, what's interesting about the reason why it's licensed per socket is because when you license something per socket, you're actually going to say, oh, I don't know, I'm going to need 16 sockets when I go and purchase my ESX. Once I buy those 16 sockets and install those down here in my virtual center server, I can then add to my environment any number of servers as long as the number of sockets in that infrastructure doesn't go over 16. So if I add a 8 socket server, then I have 8 left. If I do all 2 socket servers, then I can continue to go up. What's interesting about this is that as the number of cores per socket actually increases, we're getting more performance per socket. So if you can put more cores into a socket, you know, if you've got 2 sockets and each one is a 4-way, then you actually get more processor power out of your individual licensing at the VMware or the ESX 3.0.1 layer. Now, they may change this at some point when we start getting massive numbers of cores per socket, but as it stands now, it's licensed per socket. Additionally, you need to purchase a license here also for the Virtual Center server as well. And this is a management license that allows Virtual Center to manage those ESX infrastructures. And one of the common things that people forget about is they go and they buy their ESX licenses, and then they forget to buy their Virtual Center license, and then they have no way of managing them as a group. So make sure that you also buy your Virtual Center licenses as well. As it stands now, there are 3 different ways of purchasing ESX. There's Starter, there is Standard, and then there's Enterprise. The interesting thing about these different licenses is it gives you the ability to kind of start out in a minimal installation and work your way up as you desire the added features as you get closer and closer to the enterprise level. With the starter level license, you really just get ESX. You get the ability to install ESX and host a number of virtual machines. You get the ability to connect those virtual machines in with direct attached storage. You do not, however, get the ability to connect that storage into a storage area network, a SAN. When you move to standard edition, that's when you actually gain that ability to connect those systems into a SAN. That's if you have a SAN, you buy standard. If you don't have a SAN, you buy starter. And the difference in price between starter and standard is substantial enough that if you don't really need those high availability features, then you probably don't need to go and purchase standard. You can just include your virtual machines on the local machine and then leave them there. If you need to migrate them, you can do a cold migration when they're powered off. So if you don't need high availability, you can start out pretty inexpensively, and you don't have to have that storage area network. It's not until you get to the enterprise level that you get all of the nifty data center enterprise features. And those are high availability, the much lauded vMotion capability, the distributed resource scheduling that allows you to move systems, load balance systems across multiple ESX by resource use. All of these, and also VMware Consolidated Backup, which is the integrated VMware backup to back up the VMDK files. All of this comes when you purchase the Enterprise Edition. Now, it's worth saying that the Enterprise Edition is substantially more expensive than the Starter Edition. So think about what you need in your environment when you decide to make the move from wherever you're at into ESX. It's worth saying also that all the different products that VMware has, there's Workstation, there's Server, used to be called GSX, and then there's ESX. Of those products, as you move from Workstation to Server and Server to ESX, you'll find that the performance increases substantially. And the reason for that is because this ESX instance here actually is, unlike Server and unlike Workstation, it is not an application that resides on top of another operating system. And because that does not reside on top of another operating system, it does not need to deal with all the extraneous and unnecessary processes that are going on that operating system. Think about your Windows Vista box, for example. On your Windows Vista box, how much stuff is really running, right? There's all this extra stuff that is consuming resources that you really would prefer to go to your virtual machines. Same thing with Server. Server is typically installed on top of a Linux instance or on top of a Windows instance. And either one of those, Linux or Windows, is going to have a window manager, or it's going to have the Windows shell. It's going to have all this other stuff, again, that is consuming resources. ESX is actually its own operating system. It's a variant of a Linux kernel that is highly optimized for doing one thing. You could almost call it an appliance. And that one thing is essentially running virtual machines. And so when you move into ESX, even at the starter edition, you gain a lot of performance increases, because at that starter edition, you are having a very thin operating system that's got all the unnecessary stuff locked out of the operating system, so it's not even really used. So if you're looking for performance, it's worth the extra couple of bucks even to move just to starter edition, so you can move into this high-performing ESX infrastructure. Really, the last thing that we have to talk about before we move into actually installing ESX is the idea of the prerequisites associated with getting it installed. ESX can be one of the most cantankerous operating systems on the market right now in order to get it installed. And the reason for that is that the prerequisites that it requires in order to make it run properly are substantial. And part of the reason is because it's doing so much work. The people at VMware want to make sure that it functions properly. And as an enterprise data center type product, they want to make sure you don't buy the product and you don't like it because it's not running. You're trying to run it on a white box. It's really not meant for it. VMware has a hardware compatibility list that you can download off of their website, the VMware HCL. And whenever you go to VMware's website, you're going to want to make sure that any server class hardware that you're using for purposes of production instances of VMware, VSX, needs to be residing on that HCL. So if it's a Dell, if it's an IBM system, if it's an HP system, if it's any type of the major manufacturers and any of their more recent versions of their hardware platforms are going to be on that HCL. You have to be very, very careful that you do include those on those HCLs, or include your hardware that is on that HCL. Additionally, there is a number of network cards and HBA cards or iSCSI initiator cards that need to be available on that system as well. And so for you to properly run ESX, you have to have at least a dual processor. It requires at least a dual processor, and it needs a number of network cards to be able to function. And when we get a little bit later into virtual switches, we'll talk about what the requirements are for those network cards. But those cards need to be gigabit Ethernet cards because you're going to be running lots and lots of connections from your ESX server into your SAN. Secondly, if you're going to connect into a fiber channel SAN, you're going to need to have a fiber channel HBA card, a host bus adapter card. And arguably, you probably want to have two so that you have a redundancy in there. So if you're connecting into a fiber channel SAN, you're going to need that HBA card. If you're connecting into an iSCSI SAN, there is a software initiator that you can use that's a software piece of code that will connect you into an iSCSI target. Or you can use a hardware iSCSI initiator that is available. There's only one available, and it's on the HCL of what that one card is that's available. For the most part, if you want to offload the processing of that iSCSI connection, you'll want to use the iSCSI hardware initiator. Otherwise, if you're not looking for high performance, you can use the software initiator. And later on, when we talk about connecting to iSCSI storage, we'll talk about what those hardware initiators are, what the software initiators are, and we'll actually create a connection using a software initiator so we can show you what that looks like. So you're going to need some sort of connection into a storage area network. You're going to need multiple processors. You're going to need server class equipment. And then you're going to need, obviously, the licenses to be able to start. Now, for the purposes of our demonstration using Workstation 6.0, we're not going to, we don't have that. We don't have some heavy-duty equipment to show you. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to simulate these requirements using VMware Workstation. We're going to create a couple of ESX chassis, 2 to be precise. Each of these chassis is going to have 4 network cards. They're going to have 2 processors. They're going to have, and we're going to create iSCSI connections to our iSCSI SAN. I don't have a fiber channel SAN here on site, but we'll show you an example of a fiber channel SAN later on. We're going to use the software initiator to create our connection, and then we're going to build this ESX infrastructure so we can show you what it looks like. Let's go ahead and begin that process now. So let's go ahead and bring up our Workstation instance here. This is the one that we've worked on before. I've actually removed all the previous VMs that we've done up to this point because we're going to create 2 new virtual machines. And we're going to call them ESX Nugget 1 and ESX Nugget 2. Before I do that, though, I want to show you here, we have already downloaded the ESX ISO. This is 3.0.1, and this is the ISO file for the ESX installation itself. And then we also have an evaluation license here that we'll use to kind of drive this instance so we can see all the stuff that we want to see. We're going to create those machines. We're going to put the files here inside of this folder here so we can begin the process of building those 2 machines. So I'm going to go ahead and start this process by clicking on File and New and creating a new virtual machine. Now you're going to need to follow along pretty carefully here because the process of building these virtual machines it's not complicated compared to what we've done before with creating virtual machines, but there are a couple of things that you're going to need to know to do. So I'm going to create a new virtual machine. I'm going to hit Next, and I'm going to create a custom virtual machine, and my little Vista thing pops up to tell me that that's all right. I'm going to click Next here, and the virtual machine hardware compatibility that I want to choose is Workstation 5, and I want to make sure that this is ESX server compatible. By doing that, that ensures that I can actually build an ESX server that functions. I'm going to click Next here, and I'm going to choose Linux, and Red Hat Linux is the version. Again, VMware ESX is a highly customized version of Red Hat Linux and a Red Hat Linux kernel. So when we create this, we're going to presume that it is a Red Hat Linux kernel. I'm going to click Next again, and the machine name I'm going to create is ESX Nugget 1. And the location we're going to put it in is back on the desktop where we've put everything else thus far. There's the desktop here, and then the location on the desktop is this virtual machines location. I'm going to create a new folder called ESX Nugget 1 and stick those files in this folder. I'm going to click Next. I need to choose 2 processors because VMware or ESX does require 2 processors in order to function. In fact, the more the better. I'm going to click Next again, and then I'm going to provide this host with a gig of RAM. So we're going to start out with at least a gig of RAM. We may need to add a little bit more later if we run out of RAM. This particular machine has 3.5 gigs of RAM available to us. We've got 4 gigs of RAM in this workstation. So we've got plenty of RAM with which to work with. But for this machine, we're going to give it a gig of RAM, and we're going to start there. I'm going to click Next. The next type of messaging or networking we need to use is bridged network. And we want to use bridged networking because we want the machines to be able to work with not only with each other, but also with systems also on this network as well. I click next again, and the type of SCSI adapter that I want to choose in this case is the LSI logic adapter. And you'll need to choose this LSI logic adapter in order for it to function properly. We're going to create a new virtual disk, and that virtual disk is going to be of a SCSI type because ESX server compatible virtual machines do not support IDE disk. And we talked about this before. So now that we're here on the disk screen, we want to create a disk size that is large enough so that we can support not only creating the ESX instance, but also supporting a virtual machine that we're going to use as our sample virtual machine inside the environment. So I'm going to create 20 gigs of space for us for this virtual machine. Now, again, we can choose to allocate all the disks now. We probably ought to do that at this point. In fact, let's go ahead and choose to allocate all the disk space now for the purposes of keeping this as performing as highly as possible. Now, the one thing that's going to do is later on when we actually build this virtual disk, it's going to take a while for it to actually create the virtual disk. And we'll pause the recording when we actually get there. We're going to change the disk file name so we know what it is, esxnugget1.vmdk, and then we're going to click Finish. Now, you'll see here that it's creating the disk file. Now, this process takes a little bit of time because it's actually got to create a 20 gigabyte disk structure. And what I'm going to do is pause the recording while we wait for this disk to complete. And when we get back, we'll actually have that first characteristics of our first ESX nugget go ahead and it'll be created. Okay, and it appears that we're done. I'm going to go ahead and say that we don't want to show this page again, but our virtual machine has been created successfully at this point. Now, I told you that there was a couple of kind of odd steps that need to happen in order for us to make this virtual machine work, and that's because we actually have to edit the VMX file in order to provide some additional functionality that would not normally be available. And I'm not going to get into detail about what this functionality is, but just follow along with me and we'll get this set up in the way we're supposed to. The next thing we need to do is actually close down the existing instance that we've created and remove it from our favorites. We want to get rid of any connection to this so that we don't have any lingering problems that go on whenever we make these changes to this VMX file. And then I'm going to close down VMware and open up my ESX Nugget 1 here and take a look at my VMX file. I'm going to open it up with Notepad. And there's the VMX file within Notepad. And let me maximize it here so we can see it inside the screen. There's a couple of things that we need to add in order to make sure that we can properly boot this machine the way we're supposed to. The first of which is that we need to actually change what the network card is that is the default network card for use by this machine. Right here under Ethernet 0.present, we need to change this, add in another entry in here, Ethernet 0.virtual dev equals E1000. We want to change the typical network card, the VMware network card, so it uses the Intel E1000 card. We want to make sure that the connection type is bridged, so we go Ethernet 0 dot connection type equals bridged. And then lastly, Ethernet net 0 dot address type equals generated. Okay. The last thing we need to do down here on the very bottom is we also need to enable some other capabilities. We're going to do monitor control dot restrict backdoor equals true, and then monitor control dot VT32 equals true. We want to use those VT extensions, and we also want to restrict the VMware tools from using a backdoor capability that it uses in order to that it would normally prevent us from actually making this function. So I'm going to go ahead and close this down now. We're going to save the file, and then we're going to open it back up inside of Workstation. And so I double-click the file again, and then that will open up Workstation for us again. I want to make sure I add this to my favorites now because I'm ready to go with this particular instance. So now we have ESX Nugget 1. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the recording for just a second, and I'm going to create the second version of ESX Nugget 2, because we want to have these two instances. And inside of these two instances, we're going to create the two instances, but we're going to just show how we're going to do the installation on one of the two instances. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording. When I come back, you'll see an ESX Nugget 2. Okay, and we're back. Obviously, the first thing we need to do is connect in our CD-ROM drive so that our CD-ROM drive is connected into our ESX ISO image. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll click on the desktop and then over here and then connect it into our ISO image. And then once we're done that, the next thing we need to do, obviously, is boot the system. So let's go ahead and start this virtual machine and get the system booted. First thing we're going to be asked is, do we want that virtual floppy drive to power on every time we power on the virtual machine? We don't, like with all the times we see this error message, we don't need to see this floppy drive, so we're going to say no to this. We see the BIOS screen here, and as soon as the BIOS screen occurs, we're going to begin the boot into Anaconda, which is the Red Hat Linux installation program. You'll see here we'll have to hit the Enter key to install ESX Server in graphical mode. If you have a system but for some reason doesn't install very well with graphical mode, you can always install it in text mode, which gives you the old, I don't know if you've ever done a Linux installation, it's the blue screen that shows, just similar to this, that but all of the questions are here inside of this blue screen. We know that our media is all right, so we can skip the test, the media test. This actually tests the media to make sure that it actually meets its MD5 checksum so that you've got a good copy of the media. You'll see down here while we're waiting that we've got our 3 network cards here. We've got our hard drive light, our CD drive light, our hard drive light over here, and also our floppy drive light that we don't have connected at this point. And now we've got the ESX Server 3 installation. Now again, because this is 800 by 600, I'm going to have to do some moving around here to make sure that we can see all of the entries in here. But I'm going to click Next to begin the process. The next thing we need to do is choose US English as the keyboard type and click Next. Once we're done with that, we need to make sure that we choose a wheel mouse, PS2, or whatever type of mouse that we plan on using. Interestingly enough, that once we do the installation, the mouse information doesn't make any difference anymore because ESX doesn't install a window manager. So having a mouse is only going to help us for this one part of the actual use of our ESX server. We have to go and accept the terms of the license agreement, just like we do with all installations. And we said, okay, the partition table on device SDA was unreadable. Do you want to create a new partition? We've created that 20 gig partition, but it doesn't have any kind of a file system on it. So we want to actually format that drive and give it a file system. The next screen shows us, okay, how do we want to partition the disks for this system? For the most part, you can use the recommended partitioning model and install it onto the device that is on there. You see, we only have one disk actually created for this system, so we're going to list that disk as where we want to put it on. If you have existing virtual machines and a VMFS file system on a server, you can click this checkbox to keep those virtual machines around. Now, interesting to note is that a lot of times when you call into VMware for support on ESX servers, one of the things they're going to tell you is, well, if you're having problems with your ESX server, go ahead and drop the disk in and just rebuild the server. Because as you'll find, the process for building an ESX server is going to take really not that long. It takes about 5 minutes to answer all the questions and another 10 minutes for it to complete the installation. So this checkbox comes in handy if you have machines on the direct attached storage inside of a partition on that storage. If you choose advanced, you're going to actually have to create all the system partitions for yourself. And for our purposes, we're going to choose the recommended just because we don't want to have to go through and create all of those partitions manually. What we do then is we remove the existing partitions and create new ones, and then it gives us the option of how we want to set up those partitions. If you're familiar with Linux, we have a slash partition or a root partition here that is the main partition where all of our stuff gets installed to. We have a slash boot partition for boot information and a slash var slash log partition here also for log information. These are split out so that if our logs actually fill up, it's going to fill up one partition, but it won't fill up root and crash the system. You'll see here that there's a VMFS3 partition that's about 12 gigs in size. This VMFS3 partition is the partition where our VMs would be stored if they were on the local system. So we talked about that direct attached storage back earlier where the VMs were actually installed directly onto the hard drives here on our ESX box. This is this VMFS3 partition that is installed directly onto the hard drives. We're not doing any kind of a boot from SAN here, so we're actually installing the OS local to the ESX drive. And then a little later on when we talk about iSCSI and fiber channel storage, we'll talk about how we will move those machines over to those remote storage, those remote shared storage. So what we're going to do here is create this 12 gigabyte partition for us to be able to store some systems on directly on that host. We also have a swap partition here for swapping memory out and a VMK core partition for core dump information if we ever have a core dump, and hopefully we won't. I'm going to click Next here, and we're going to ask how do we want the ESX server to boot. We can either boot it from a drive or from a partition if we want to boot from SAN, for example. From a drive, we get the option of which drive do we want to choose it on, and we're going to choose the only drive that's available to us. If we have some advanced options for boot up, again, maybe some boot from SAN options for booting, these are passed to the kernel, to the Red Hat kernel at boot time. The next screen actually gives us the option to change the networking configurations of the Ethernet controllers that are plugged into our network. You'll see here, here's this E1000 card that we created. If you have multiple network cards that you've plugged in, you can drop this drop-down list to change the network settings for each of the network cards that are plugged into your system. We're going to go ahead and plug in the IP address for this, 192.168.0.101, same subnet mask, gateways.1. Our primary DNS server is DC Nugget, which is .70. It also does DNS services for our domain. And here in the host name, this is something that I see a lot of people forgetting to do, but you got to plug in the FQDN for the machine into this host name field, the fully qualified domain name. So you're going to want to put in esxnugget1.nuggetlab.com here. If you forget to do this here, it's kind of a pain to actually go back and change the host name of that system. You got to plug into the Linux and get it done. Down here under VLAN settings, you'll see a VLAN ID. The particular network does not have VLAN capability in it, but if you do and you have a specific VLAN for this ESX host, you might want to plug that VLAN ID in here. You can also change it later if you want. And we're also going to create this default network for virtual machines. When we start talking about virtual switches, we're going to talk about what that actually means. So for now, this is the networking configuration for that interface on our ESX server. Obviously, we have to give it a time zone. I'm actually recording this here in Denver, here in the Mountain Time Zone, so we'll give the Mountain Time Zone. Click Next again, and then we need to give it a password. You'll see here that the process of building an ESX server is relatively simple, and really the hardest part is really finding that and getting that network card information ready to go, right? So I'm going to go ahead, and there's the summary information, and I click Next to final time, and it begins now the process of doing the installation. This installation takes about 10 to 15 minutes to complete, as it's transferring those RPM packages from the ESX CD into the ESX server. Now, what's interesting about an ESX server is because the ESX server actually has quite a bit fewer packages than a typical Red Hat installation, that process of installing ESX server takes substantially less time than it does to do a regular Red Hat installation. You'll see here we're about 20 minutes into the package. Also, if you're using an ISO file instead of a CD, that'll decrease the time it takes to complete that as well. So I'm going to pause the recording. We're going to complete the installation here on ESX Nugget 1, and also while we're paused, we're going to complete the installation on ESX Nugget 2 as well. And when we come back, we're going to have two completely installed ESX servers. Okay, and we're back. And what we've actually gone through is completed the ESX server installation. There was one more screen that essentially says, hey, you're done. Go ahead and reboot now. That I went ahead and went through and completed the reboot process. And now you'll see we're back here at the ESX server console screen. So we're at the service console right now. And as you can see, there's really not that much to see in the service console. It says if you want to manage this ESX server, you've got to use any browser to open up this URL and download the virtual infrastructure client. Now, we talked about how the virtual server kind of manages the ESX chassis, and the virtual infrastructure client manages that virtual server. Well, you can use that virtual infrastructure client to either manage the virtual server or the individual ESX server, and we're going to go ahead and show how that's done at this point. Now, here inside of the service console, really once you've got the server built, you don't do a lot right on the console anymore, but if you need to, you can always go and hit the Alt F1 key to get your typical logon prompt, just like you would for any Linux server out there. This is a VMware EXI Server 3, and you log on with your root password or some other password that you might have created for that particular system, and then you've got your standard Linux console interface. But again, for the most part, you really don't use this interface all that much. You really kind of leave it back in the data center and then manage it with the VIC. So let's go ahead and show what happens whenever you go to that 192.168.0.101. After you complete the installation of your first ESX server, this is the web server that shows up whenever you go to the IP address for that service console. And what you need to do is download the VMware infrastructure client. When you download that VMware infrastructure client, it's going to download your local machine, and then it's going to begin to, then you can install the client from there. Once the client's installed, you'll use that client to actually manage these systems. Here, I brought it up right here. This is the virtual infrastructure client. And if we plug it in and we connect to the server either by IP address or by host name if we've configured our DNS properly, and we put in initially the root as our username because we haven't created any users at this point, and then whatever password we've assigned for root. It's going to connect into our infrastructure, load the inventory, and give us the ability to manage our ESX server. Now in this nugget, we've got one task that we want to accomplish, and that only task at this point is actually installing the proper license files for our ESX server. Let's go ahead and install the license files, and then in the upcoming nuggets, we're going to go through and take a look at this virtual infrastructure client and all the things that you can do with the VIC. Now, in order to get our license, we first of all have to go onto the VMware website and download the license file. And we're not going to show the process for doing that. It's relatively trivial. If you have a for cost license that you've actually paid for, you can get it from pretty much the same location that you get the eval licenses from. If I go ahead and bring up this our location here on our server, I'll show you we've got this license.txt file. This particular license file you can use, we're going to use in order to enable the features for this ESX server. To add the license file to an ESX server, we need to click on the configuration tab, and if we scroll over here to the right, you'll see licensed features. We're clicking down here under software for licensed features. Right now we don't have any licensed features, so we're going to click the edit button here, and we're going to choose to use a host license file. When we install our virtual center server, that's when we actually move from using host-based license files to a licensed server. But for now, because we're using just this one single instance, we're going to use a host-based license file. I'm going to click Browse here and go to my desktop and then find this license file that I was looking for. And there's the text file right there, license.txt. I click OK. And we see host license file installed. And you should see now that the file on the host is present. Those host files will either come as a .txt or a .lic extension, depending on how you get them. If we hit the edit now, we can actually change from an unlicensed ESX server to an ESX server standard edition. And now you'll see that because we have ESX server standard, we can use some of those features associated with ESX server standard. We are licensed for 2 CPUs. We have 2 CPUs on the server. We have the ability to do iSCSI and SAN connections, up to 4-way virtual SMP and an attachment to NAS as well. There's also some additional add-ons that we could potentially use. Here's a VMware Consolidated Backup add-on that we have in this license file. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is that there is no ESX Server Enterprise Edition location here, because the Enterprise Edition licenses only work whenever you're using a virtual center server. So this is the process by which we add the license files to our ESX server. Once we move again into a virtual center server, we're going to change that license over, and the VMware website allows you to change it from host-based to FlexLM-based. Will allow you to change that license over so it can be used on the virtual center server. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We talked a lot about ESX and all the components of ESX and all the things that you're going to want to know in order to do your ESX. So we talked about the virtual center server. We talked about the virtual infrastructure client. We talked about some prerequisites that you're going to require in order to run ESX. How have these heavy hardware requirements in order to run ESX. Then we also went through an entire process of installing ESX onto 2 different servers so that we can begin the process of building our infrastructure. And then lastly, we touched for a moment on the process of licensing ESX. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.